Hi, everyone. Welcome to Institutional and Legal Aspects of Managed Retreat. We're going to start with our first speaker today, Ju-Ching Huang. As a quick reminder, this is also being done as a webinar as well, and so you will be able to receive the recording online later. If you have any questions, please feel free to either write them in the chat or ask them at the very end. All right.
Good morning, everyone. So nice to be here today. My name is Ju-Ching Huang. I'm a Maryland State Grant Legal and Policy Fellow and also a SJD student from Georgetown Law. Today I'm going to talk about institutional transition in managed retreat, from localized rights-based approach to centralized process-centric approach. This morning, I have also with our federal agencies and talking about how they intercoordinated with each other. And transformative adaptation governance is the key to build resilience. It is in our recent IPCC report pointed that out. And part of this transformative adaptation governance, it involves institutional transition. So one institution in this case is the vertical and horizontal governance, which includes federal agencies of different sectors come together, coordinate with each other, but also we need to focus on vertical. How do we have these federal, state, and local come together and then working together? That's the institutional part of governmental organization. The other key point here is also about the process. How do we design a decision-making process to integrate adaptation, engagement, transparency, accountability, all elements that's already in place and make it work and make the decision-making process. So to begin, I want to start by walk you through a case that I've studied. I have specified the case, the town name, and I want you to focus instead on this institutional dynamics between different actors and the procedures. So let's see how this works. Okay. Yes. So to begin with this small town, it has major features. The whole city boundaries is within a 100-year flood. And the second feature is that the whole scenery is mostly salt marshes. The salt marshes can absorb the energy from the storm waves. However, it cannot stop the nuisance flood. And nuisance flood happens every day in these towns, even on a sunny day. And the social feature here is that the major economic activities here is the fisheries and seafood processing. And 70% of them are white people. And one thing I want to note is that 1/3 of the population here in this town live in the public housing. So when we're talking about flood adaptation, two key documents we will be looking at from a legal perspective. One is looking at the plan. We look at local comprehensive plan, whether they have coastal resilience building, whether they have how do we deal with the flood risk. We have hazard mitigation plan. On the other hand, we're also looking at whether they have regulations in place. So floodplain management ordinance and leading shorelands. What I found is that they have local comprehensive plan, but it's back in 2010. So they're predicting or projecting the population growth, when after 10 years, it's not so much, and they are facing a population loss. And on the other hand, they have hazard mitigation plan in order for them to apply for grants from FEMA, but they have not updated them. So because by not doing so, they are not focusing on how to deal with their hazard. On the other hand, they have perfect regulations in the book, and because it's very proactive rule, like the state mandate. So they have setbacks, they have elevation, they have in the book. They even say critical infrastructure, such as hospitals, fire stations, police stations, should not be built in special hazard areas. However, in this case, the whole area is within the special hazard areas. So there's no way they can build their infrastructures, critical infrastructures, outside the special hazard. They have living shorelines. They have salt marshes. but it's not going to help their new thing. So this state has continuously facing these. No worries. So I want to focus on in the past 5 years, there are three types of federal involvement coming directly to this. They have become the focus. One is very typical. The federal government gives the money. And how do they use this money? First is from HUD and NOAA. They help the sponsor to these towns to do a genuine report and identify areas that are vulnerable and also provide adaptation measures. However, retreat or inland migration is not part of these conversations or these solutions to the flood. And based on this assessment, FEMA PDM grants come in, and then to help them to install tide gates and also pumping stations. And then there are also effective ones. There are more and more capital assistance kick in. So FEMA break these new grants. They also have this direct technical assistance. So they are helping them to write the grant proposal. And with that, EPA has also come in, and they also pick the same town and to demonstrate and help them to how to use this new tool to evaluate their stormwater management. All this technical support coming in directly from the center. And there's a hybrid type where the NGOs get the fundings from the federal government with other research institutes like universities, centers, and to figure out using the climate modeling and also the finance analysis, help with an understanding communities' needs. They have money, and also EPA comes in again with another group that they help to understand how nature can be helpful in these things. So this is just demonstrating there is a strong federal momentum coming down to the local. And so what we found here, first that everyone's goal here is to mitigate the flood. Everyone is based on the drainage assessment report that focus on how do we fix the drainage. It's very helpful and truly helpful in the short term that can to reduce the flood. And everyone's using similar tools, using the climate modeling, using how do we analysis the flood, and then about cost benefit analysis, and then giving up the grant so they can fix the system. One key element is missing here. All these cost benefit analysis did not include retreat or inland migration, or even the discussion of how to help the people moving towards safer ground when their whole area is within the floodplain. And even the FEMA floodplain is a low bar in under the current climate. So I want to start with, and I want to start from talking about emerging institutions. Through this case study, we are seeing that previously it's mostly from a localized approach, that local communities come in and they are applying for the grant by the federal government. Now we are seeing with this whole government centralized approach, there's a strong federal resources trickling down to the directly to the local community. Then the problem is, how do we better utilize technical assistance using its expertise and capacities in a more efficient and just way? And the other thing is also need to be mentioned is that when we used to talk about how do we implement buyout, like implement managed retreat, buyout is one of the key way to do it, but we are focusing on property rights. It's a right base, it's a piecemeal approach, which is also very effective and helpful. However, in the scenario I just addressed, 1/3 of the population lives in the public housing. So property rights not necessarily can help them move in a way that really helps the community. But we have to think it in a more comprehensive way and thinking about how do we design the procedural process to make policy making more effective. So I want to focus on the coordination at the federal level. This probably is something that everyone, like oh, not again. It's like very common. We need coordinate. A borrowed idea from the agency coordination, their regulatory space. So this is what happened, and probably a lot of you have attended morning sessions. This is what's happening, and also presented by Jody Freeman, Maryland time ago. She's saying that presidents uniquely in order in collaborating and coordinating all the separate resources together. And so we have climate policy office, we have community-driven relocation that's happening. However, it's not enough. We need to consider agency coordination tools. What does that mean, coordination tools? As already federal agencies doing a lot, but there is more they can probably be thinking about. One is about interagency agreements, that's like MOUs, and one is about joint policy making. It doesn't necessarily have the formal rulemaking. It can just be some guidelines for task force, joint team. So they can pool the resources and share the expertise. In the case of study, and also in many situations around local communities, the FEMA money and HUD's money can be more streamlined and to reduce the redundancy in people. And their technical assistance can be streamlined as well to make it more cohesive and consistent. So this is from the horizontal federal agency coordination. So how does that look like? This is very preliminary, but some costs. So for instance, if we're talking about maybe if the whole local jurisdiction is within 100 years, whether their cost benefit analysis should also include inland migration in any type of ways. If there's no certain ways of doing this, but whether they have to be addressed when they are applying for the grants to fix their drainage system or to build another side gate. Is this an option on the table when they are doing cost benefit analysis or doing climate modeling? The second is if the community has multiple federal agencies for technical or monetary financial assistance, whether they have the duty obligation to actually let the federal agency know. So, for instance, they're asking money from FEMA and they're asking money from HUD. Whether these two agencies should have somehow some knowledge about their applying political grants and how they can better coordinate with each other, that's something that can be think about and then utilize these legal documents to make it a better coordination between different agencies. So this is the horizontal coordination, and then this is how we are seeing that federal monies and technical assistance trickling down directly to the. So what is missing here? So the states, the regional, and everything else can play a role actually better coordinate. And this still need to be figured out in different local governments, in different scenarios, and regional have different politics and different dynamics going on. But however that is, with all these federal resources and expertise and capacities trickling down to communities, we are seeing like the fragmented overlapping is not working, and time is not waiting for us to figure that out. And so, how do we better coordinate it is the key to moving. To some 3 points. One is transformative adaptations involve institutional shift, either purposeful or unintended. It is necessary to think about institutional. And we're seeing that emerging shift and how we better utilize, leverage it to serve our purpose. So we have this centralized approach from the federal government, but also streamlined down to local communities. So how do we improve this interagency coordination with the tools that we know exist? And we have to focus on the process to make sure all the options, adaptation options, have been thought of to ensure a long time benefit. Thank you. That's all for my presentation.
Hi, Thanks for everybody to be here, and I really feel like what I'm going to have to say has a lot to do with Ms. Huang, what you were saying, and so I'm really glad to hear that. So this is we are doing a comparative study around the world, and I'll talk about the data in a minute. And this is one of the issues that we've been looking at is planning. And so in terms of, I guess we could call spatial planning is what the Europeans call it. It's a little bit broader than spatial planning, of course, in all of your own experiences, to financial planning, ecosystem. But if we start with the idea of spatial planning, it's actually really suited for all sorts of coastal managed retreat options because you're dealing with land, future visioning, and then steps to get there, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do was look at what planning is being actually done. And it's not necessarily done by formal planners, and it's not necessarily done by formal planning agencies. So all the agencies that Ms. Huang was talking about probably have professional planners on board, but a lot of the cases we looked at, people who are not professional planners are doing what we could consider to be planning. So I said, well, I have to figure out what planning is. So what the urban planning theorists have tended to talk about is the formal tools we associate mostly through rational spatial planning, right? So we can, we're in the city of that has experienced many waves of rational planning. So for coastal retreat, we would think about zoning and setback rules. So you mentioned setbacks as one of the things, and this is a very interesting aspect of coastal planning. It seems like a very rational approach, you say, that you have rules that any structure should be set back a certain distance, usually from mean high tide. That prevents new structures being put into the location, and then eventually could affect existing structures that they would have to be moved because they're now in violation. So that's a formal rational planning model. But we could also think about more formal aspects of planning as including customary. In other words, well established, they're not necessarily written into black letter law, but they're well established. And then on the other hand, planners have tried to grapple with the idea of soft planning. There are all sorts of terminologies people have used, radical planning and formal planning. A lot of confusion about this. I think we agree with Christina Cravico and her colleagues that these terms have been really poorly defined and often used in different ways by different people. So one of the aspects that we would like to talk about sharpening is the who is doing the planning, because soft planning has been used to characterize both things like governments giving incentive grants, right? They're not required, it's less coercive, et cetera, but also to include community organizing. So if you have people organizing entirely outside of the formal government, that very much affects what can be done to a particular location. But the same term covering both seems a little bit sloppy. So we looked at how people are down. Okay, thanks. So we asked 3 questions. And the first question is what human uses are being moved? And essentially these could include things like cultural values. I think it's really important for us to think about uses rather than structures. And the origin of the coastal management retreat, discussion is really still remains very much an engineering for good reason, because they've given it a lot of thought. But if we think in terms of uses, then what we understand is that coasts being what they are, extremely vital economically, socially, culturally, and the rest, we're going to have a range of uses that are well beyond structures and well beyond people who normally participate in land use planning. And so the question of who is moving very much depends on what uses are being moved. And a lot of these actors have no experience in planning. So to echo what you were saying, Ms. Wang was saying about institutions, we're going to see throughout this, we're very concerned about what are the opportunities for institutions. And so to do this, we looked at, again, trying to figure out what is planning, which, it's one of those disciplines where they're debating it all the time. But the last question is about what tools are these actors using? So again, some of these are non-professional. So we used Dominic Stead's analysis of planning tools. And he said, well, there's been a lot of debate about what tools are. And you're going to look at this and say, well, where are the tools? He says the important thing to look at in three aspects of planning, plan making and review, developing the plan, and enforcing the plan, is that for each of these aspects, you're going to have a different bundle of tools, and the actors will change an aspect to another. So being careful not to see these as stages that are, necessarily sequential, although they can be, they're interactive, right? So that's why he uses aspects rather than stages. So plan making and review in planning normally takes about 10 to 20. In coastal change situations, we have not been having 10 to 20. The backdrop that Ms. Huang was talking about, right, of these sort of planning tools, they're not suited for the decisions that people are making. So plan making and review is either squeezed down to nothing or it simply doesn't exist in emergencies. So developing the plan, which in, the sort of rational planning mode would be permitting development, for example. So you set the procedures for permitting. Many people are involved in the plan making and review. Fewer people are around for setting the rules, although we know that's extremely, extremely important. So the tools for plan making and review include things like public participation, public hearings, notification, very much focused on getting the broad set of assessments and the like, developing the plan. This is after the goals are set. This is, lawyers involved, and we're talking about the feasibility. When you're enforcing the plan, again, if we're in a rational plan, you've got each individual developer submitting. So that's narrowing down the actors. In coastal retreat, again, the plan making and review is often shrunk down to nothing. And so developing the plan may be in the hands of people and may not even include the people who are being moved, right? And so enforcement of the plan, that is someone's big idea about what we should do, may be really constrained because the plan was not really developed in the normal way. So just to give you some ideas, what we're going to do is we're not going to talk so much about what human uses are being moved. We're going to really focus on who is moving these uses. How do these actors use these three aspects? And I'm not really going to go into great detail, but just give you a few cases. We are still struggling with the soft planning, but Stead thinks of this formal to informal as a continuum, and so this is my sort of rough continuum. So if we think about using the focus on hard planning or formal tools, I use the most rational planning oriented thing. As I said, it's coastal setback rules on paper sound very wonderful because you've alerted property owners that the conditions that you accept on purchase of this property are that you have to have your setback a certain distance. If you have existing structures, you know that you will have to move them in the future. In practice, what we found is that cases in Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, there were very few that had actually been implemented. And the process from plan making, development to enforcement was very contentious. So the idea that we're going to have a sort of simple metric, we could put lines on the map, and we're all wary about lines on the map. Here it seems like the best case scenario, right? People are informed. It's got all sorts of mechanisms that are embedded in democratic processes, and yet it's not working well, to say the least. Very tiny properties involved, and endless debates about how. There are a couple sessions. I'm sure they will talk about this because a couple of our cases involved, these incredibly interesting definitions of what is the distance from the coast. So anyway, that's one. So the second, it turns out that we have a retreat case that involves the poster child of soft planning, which is the Thames, it's called the Thames Estuary Production Corridor. I'm sorry, I never, Thames Estuary Production Corridor, that is the poster child for soft planning, which is this sort of neoliberal public-private partnership. We will relax some of the rules in order to facilitate other social goals. In this case, the Tate Modern and the Millennium Dome in the Olympics, the process was we would give you some development concessions, being able to build higher, or something that normally would not be permitted if you agreed to build any new structures farther away from the Thames. And so, so this is a combination. Certainly, regulations are in the background because the soft planning negotiation approach, we would just hit you with. And so this is, like I said, it's the poster child for soft planning, which is it's interesting that there is a retreat option there because that's not been the emphasis of planning literature on reading. So another case that is quite different from that, as I said, I'm trying to argue that customary practices also can be seen as being on the formal end. And some of my favorite cases were series of Pacific Islands where there was sufficient planned, managed land that when people were threatened with hazards, they were able to relocate to somewhat higher lands inland using processes that have been well established for passing on land between generations. So as the elders rotate out of farming actively and new households are formed, the land is reapportioned among clan members. So that is, from a sociological perspective, that is just as solid as zoning regulations in fact, because you have a lot of enforcers, right? There are really people who really bought into this. And very interesting to me is that many of these cases, if it involved more than a few people, they would engage the national government and aid agencies to pay for some of the process, but it had to be within that plan focus. And then there are variations, all sorts of different variations of this arrangement. But I think it's helpful for us to see, again, the planning process is not just necessarily focused on what we think of as being black letter law. And just roughly, I'm not wedded to these four dots yet, but we're still sort of. If we think regulation, soft planning, and ad hoc responses, I mean, obviously we could talk about this Sri Lankan 2000 tsunami endlessly. It takes place in the backdrop of a country that's a long-standing civil war. The people affected in this eastern region were majority Tamils. They'd already been resettled. And so, the issue of who is making decisions, it's not just the organizations that are implementing the coastal retreat, it's also households that are having to evacuate on their own. And I guess from a sociological point of view, I would use the word emergent behavior to describe that, right? So emergent behavior is not by institutions, it's by individuals and households who are looking at each other for cues and trying to do their own actions. Any institutions, therefore, have to deal with that. And so in this Sri Lankan case, mistrust of government was so high that there was a lot of non-compliance with orders to evacuate. There was a lot of the ad hoc part. What I would say is, yes, they used this same sort of response to tsunamis, but in this tsunami, this killed, I believe, 30,000 people. So that's a lot of displacement. So they did resettlement camps and the rest. One of the issues there and in other places is that I'd say that all the cases, we had 50, I didn't specify, we had 55 cases. All of those cases, more than just a handful of structures or people, have people returning to the red zones. So in other words, that's the emergent behavior that needs to. It's not just that people may relocate to other places that are unsafe, they may relocate to the place that they're be inhabiting at all. the last one I'll just point out is largely ad hoc. I think this is a category that we really need to consider, which is the invisible retreats that are happening. So these are slow retreats because of loss of productivity of land, salinization of soil, declining productivity of farmland, or people removing their investment in. There's a slow retreat that's happening. When we talk about depopulation, it's the move, you're removing from the region, you're removing labor, you're removing value and the like. And so when governments take note of this, so this is another tsunami, which was Sagar Island and Swinging Island in Cyclone Aliyah in 2009. And so the government response was largely on. We did not have in place the same sort of processes that they would have hoped. And because a lot of this was very slow in formation. So overall, what we're trying to emphasize here is that there are a number of things that we can recognize about planning. And a lot of people who are effectively doing planning, that the actors change over the aspects, right? That oftentimes there's not even a plan making, aspect that's involved. People are making decisions quickly. Certainly that the lack of a long and well-developed plan development process leads to enforcement problems of people returning to sites that are extremely hazardous. And so the idea of red zones and the rest, very, very few places manage to put them into. And so professional planners, I think it's really helpful for them to see the limitations of existing planning tools. I think that, we heard this in the previous presentation as well. Existing tools have been built to foster growth, economic growth, land development, intensification. We do have some tools for de-intensified uses, but it's mostly been left up to the marketplace to reuse places and have not been really greatly engaged. The other thing that planners really need to recognize that what we call the interested and affected parties is much larger than the usual participants in planning. In political science, we're very concerned to identify repeat players. Repeat players learn the ropes. Now, obviously, they can corrupt a system for, large land developers can really know how to game the system. But in the absence of repeat players in street cases, they're learning and relearning and relearning, but they're never there to help educate the next community. 50 yards down a coast, the threats can be quite different, right? So the opportunity for institutional learning without repeat players is very reduced in this, as opposed to other land development, situations. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
All right. Everybody can hear me? So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm Dick Norton. I teach in the Urban and Regional Planning program at the University of Michigan. I'm both a community planner and a lawyer. I started off studying coastal management in North Carolina, but I've been in Michigan for over 20 years now. In Michigan, right. Okay, which button do I hit? There we go. Okay. Michigan is part of the Great Lakes. We're going to talk about Great Lakes. The Great Lakes, are big. You cannot see across them. They're more like oceans, and Michigan enjoys most of the U.S. side. We enjoy about 66% of the U.S. side of the Great Lakes because we have two peninsulas. So we touch 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. A bumper sticker. 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. We've got lots and lots of shoreline. The shorelines are an asset. They really function more like ocean coastal settings than large lakes. And And we promote them. If you've seen the Pure Michigan campaign, come to Michigan. They always show big sandy beaches for folks to come in. They never show the seawalls that I'm going to show you. People are building. So, okay, so one thing to know about the Great Lakes is they're not large enough to be tidal. So we don't experience the twice a day water changes, but they fluctuate pretty dramatically. Seasons and decades and years. There we go. Most of that variation is natural. It cannot be controlled. There's a little bit of management that happens because of dams that are in place to manage water flow, but most of the variation is natural. We experienced a pretty long period of low water levels from about 2000 to 2013, an all-time low in 2013, a really rapid climb in water levels up to about 2020, and then close to all-time highs on all of the Great Lakes in about 2020. That's probably going to start happening more often with climate change. So we're going to see lower lows, higher highs, more frequent changes in water levels over time. Well, we're not going to experience sea level rise because we're not connected to the really. No, I don't want to leave the webinar. Okay. We're not going to experience sea level rise. We're not connected to the ocean. Most of the Great Lakes are erodible sand. So we're actually experiencing pretty intense shoreline time. As the lakes come up, they chew away at the shoreline. As they drop, they thin a little bit. The blue is how the shoreline has moved over the last 80 years. The orange is where the bluff system, we have a lot of bluff systems drop down to the beach. And then the red is where we're expecting the bluff line to go in the next 80 years. There's a lot of property close to the water's edge that's a great line in. There, I'm going to parallel a little bit the talks that have come before. The state regulates shorelines up to the ordinary watermark. The local governments can regulate that through their planning and zoning. There's very little coordination that goes on between them. Local governments in Michigan, through all the planning they're doing, a lot of communities wouldn't even know about the Great Lakes because of the picture on the plan, which is the only mention of being on the Great Lakes shoreline. Reasons for that. It's a dance though. We have these periods of high water where we're moving land and then the lakes drop and then we gain some sand. So we're going back and forth. So I think shoreline management in the Great Lakes is actually harder than the ocean coast because the lakes drop just long enough for people that they're going to come back up. So we have a lot of development pressure close to the shoreline. We're in a situation where most of the development, frankly, are really wealthy homeowners want to build big homes really close to the water's edge. And then they panic when the lakes come back up and the shoreline starts to erode again. So just to illustrate this a little bit, this is a right at the Michigan after the last a lot of the eroded. You can see some effort to try and stop it. That's what it looked like 20 years later. After a long period, huge expanse. See that pipe that was sticking way out? It's completely buried. Somebody didn't pay attention. They started to build a home. And the lakes came back up. That's what it looks like now. This is what we're facing on Great Lakes shoreline. So when the lakes came back up, we started to see homes at risk. We started to see increased flooding problems along the shoreline into the lake. But that's the concern. We're going to lose property. So we saw then with the rise of sea levels, gobs and gobs of seawalls going, and I think probably, although the state was permitting it, I'm going to talk about what's going on here. The problem, just quickly, the problem with walls are much the same as on the coast. They destroy, they accelerate erosion on adjacent properties. So maybe we've got neighbor-to-neighbor nuisance. The other one is a little bit hard to see when you are with that bottom stretch where there's no beach. That's because of the shoreline. If you look closely, it's pushing the sand offshore. So we're getting more and more evidence that it's still a long stretch of seawalls. Even the beach, when the lakes go down, we're not going to see the beaches come down because the sand's been pushed too far off the shore. And we're going to lose our beaches long term. All of those beautiful, come to Michigan, enjoy our beaches won't be there anymore because armored all of the shorelines to protect the private homes in front of them. And they have to be maintained. So if you go up and down Lake Michigan, you can see evidence of past seawalls that have failed, that they've then built bigger seawalls behind them, but they'll fail eventually too. So the day you put in a seawall, it's the day the lake starts to work to take it back out. So it's an ongoing investment in cost. And ultimately, if you don't maintain it, you lose it, and you get a lot of debris in the nearshore zone, habitat problems, health, public safety. So the question, armor, facing this problem over the long term or withdraw? That's the picture of the house that I showed on the very first slide. Property owners built too close to the water's edge. The city adopted the setback. They did it in a dynamic way. The lakes came back up. The property owners asked to get a permit to put a seawall, and the city said no. We told you not to build in the first place. You did. We've now prohibited seawalls. They had to pick up their house and move it back. But it's only a temporary solution because it's probably going to keep eroding over time. So I did a study with some colleagues on the legal side. State regulates the placement of seawalls. There are a lot of seawalls that are in. There's still a lot of land that seawalls go in. What if the state were to decide we're going to stop allowing seawalls and litigation happens? I can tell you when it happens, litigation will start happening. So this is the result from a 137-page law review article that's coming out any day now, where we step through all of the likely litigants and all of the legal cases that are likely to happen when we finally get to this point where we're litigating on whether or not we're going to I'm showing my bias, whether or not we're going to allow fuel to be built or try and maintain some kind of natural shoreline. So the big legal doctrine that we're dealing with here is the public trust doctrine. The thing about the public trust is that it's a state-specific doctrine. All of the ocean coastal states and all of the 8 Great Lakes states have a public trust doctrine, and there are a lot of similarities across them. But at the end of the day, they're all state specific. So if you're going to think about litigation in a given state, you have to know the public trust doctrine in your state, what it means. So in Michigan, we have all of the 8 Great Lakes states recognize that the submerged bottomlands of the Great Lakes are owned by the state. There's some balance now going on between state ownership of Great Lakes submerged lands and shoreline. In Michigan, under our public trust doctrine, property owners owns to the water's edge. But they also recognize a movable freehold. As the water levels go up and down, that boundary line between state-owned property and privately owned property moves back and forth as the beach inflates and deflates with water levels. So there's a dynamic system in place here. But over the long term, it's receding. And we have a right of public access up to the ordinary high water mark, which is that part of the beach that is underwater when the lakes are really high, but then becomes open again when the lakes drop. So that's pretty much at least the sandy beach, probably the beach grasses, but not the trees. The trees have not been underwater; they wouldn't be there. They would have been scoured away. So there's a public right of access on that strip of beach. Okay, so we have this movable freehold. When the lakes drop, the beaches decrease. The bottom is what it looked like after that long period of the water. The top immediately disappeared when the lakes came back up. Nonetheless, that was beach privately owned beach with the right of public access. But when the lakes recede, or when the shoreline recedes because of the land is being converted from private property to public owned state submerged bottomlands. And in a lot of places on our beaches, that is a one-way dynamic. We're going to keep seeing the shorelines recede because of the makeup of the substrate. So just to illustrate this briefly, the top is the natural beach unaffected. The middle, you can see if someone were to build a seawall and fill, that would be converting state-owned bottomland to privately owned uplands. But someone also put in a seawall. Over time, the shoreline's receding. Now you have what we're calling passive fill. Arguably, you've allowed the property owner to convert state-owned submerged bottomland to privately owned upland. Does that make sense to everybody? This has not been litigated in Michigan. That's helpful or not yet. And the idea of putting seawalls and then preventing them or forcing someone to take them out, that hasn't been litigated either, which is why we did this long review. Look to other cases in law where they've dealt with similar issues to get some sense of how the courts might rule on what litigation when it starts to happen. The other thing to know is we're a single ship state, so we have 3,200 miles of sea line, and we have 250 government that manage them. And virtually most, if not all of them, are really not doing much to manage their shorelines. flex in our intergovernmental system. The state points to the locals, you should be doing more, and the locals point to the state, you should be doing more. And so there's a lot happening in the middle ground that probably shouldn't be happening. Okay, so we have the public trust doctrine. I just kind of set through that. We do have a constitutional protection for the environment in our Michigan Constitution, in the U.S. Constitution. We have police power authority, and that's been constitutionalized as well. And then we have all of the protections of private property rights that you find in the federal doctrine. All of those doctrines have been converted into 3 key acts. The Protection Act gives the right of citizens to action if you're doing something for the environment. The Lake Submerged Land Act really implements the public trust doctrine. It seems to create a strong stand on we should be protecting the natural. There are administrative rules in place that allow permitting for armoring, which is how a lot of the armoring got put in. And we have the Shoreland Act, which theoretically says we're going to protect the shorelines, but they allow you to have longer setbacks if you armor the shoreline. So we've got laws, state laws, statutory laws, and doctrines that seem to be very protective, but we've developed administrative rules for undermining those. I think it's going to be with the fallout when a property owner comes because you got to let me do something. So there's an institutional disconnect there. Gosh, these things kind of go in parallel. And the local governments do have the police delegated to them. They've got planning, zoning, subdivision, the kind of wide array of authorities that are going on. Okay, so what's the litigation we're likely to see? The state of Michigan could decide we're going to start doing the public trust doctrine and stop allowing going. There's more and more scientific evidence. They don't work. They're going to fail. They cost a lot of money, and they're destroying the beach in the meantime. They don't allow this to happen anymore. They could find themselves on a defensive posture because you're not doing enough. We could see public interest in criminal groups maybe read this law review article and say it's time for us to sue. The state's not protecting our shoreline to get the state a better job. They would probably do that through a meeting. And they would say, we got to protect the beach. And then, of course, you're going to the property owners, particularly if they're told now you can build a seawall or your seawall is failed, it's time to take it out, they're going to sue. And they're probably going to go straight to a regulatory taking. But there are other forms of litigation they're likely to use. And recognize now we're balancing 2 things here that I think are uniform across all the coastal states. One is the public welfare and having functional, ecologically viable beaches set against private property rights. But the other is the state property set against private property rights. 2 battling property rights notions at play here. And they have different implications legally about where the courts are likely to go. Okay, so the analytical questions, I put a lot of text up here because I'm guessing they're going to share these slides with litigants. So there's more text here than what I'm going to talk about. But if you want to come back, hopefully it'll make sense because I put enough words in there. But basically, property owners have the right to protect to the point of damaging the lake. That's really the core question. Does the state have the authority to do it under the public trust doctrine to not let that happen? To say we need to protect our natural beaches. Is there a right to passively fill? If you're not actively filling, which you can't do without a permit, can you get away with it by putting it in a seawall and then stopping that natural progression that's happening? Can we do that? Okay. So just to step through, because I know where am I? How many minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so I think in terms of authorities, I think there's more than enough with state authority to say we're going to stop allowing seawalls. If we're going to say if you've got a seawall in place, you can do it while it's there, but when it becomes damaged, you're going to have to take it out. That's what we're dealing with retreat. So if someone argues, if they announce we're going to do that and a property owner sues them and says you can't do that on this basis that you have authority to do it, the state's probably going to win. It will probably prevail in authority cases. Do you have the authority to do this? What if a property owner or an environmental interest group sues the state and says you're not doing enough? We want you to do more to protect our Great Lakes beaches. We're using NEPA to get them. There's actually in NEPA-related cases the courts could go either way. It's not clear to me that this would put the state in a position. We're doing as much as we have to respect private property rights, and this is the place we're going to stand. The courts would probably defer to that. Or the courts could look at other case law and say, no, you're not protecting the environment enough like our Constitution says to. It's it's really not clear where the courts would go if that's the way the litigation plays itself out. So if environmental interest groups do, it's going to be a bit more of an ethical crime for them. If they sue a local government, which adopts a zoning ordinance that does a setback, maybe even a dynamic setback that puts people on notice at some point, if you're going to have that setback's going to keep moving. Like, so people in the Great Lakes recognize the lakes go up and down and the beach moves. What they don't really get is that it's a one-way process over time. And so they think once they set a setback that they never have to move it again. And they don't realize, no, you have to keep moving the setback as the Great Lakes recede. Local governments could do that. I think they've got plenty of authority. They don't have public trust authority. They don't own the submerged bottomlands, but they've got plenty of police authorities. I think local governments would probably win a lawsuit if they were sued. I mean, they don't have the authority to do it. Okay, what about constitutional? What are we protecting here? Property owners do have the right to exclude, except because of our public trust doctrine, they have to allow access on the same beach. So if they try to say you can't be on the beach, it sounds like that's question of public trust claim. What about the right to use to protect? I think as long as the government say you can keep using your beach as long as you have it, you just can't put in a seawall that forces passive filling. That's where they're going to get into trouble, and especially if you create a nuisance. All right, to create a nuisance. If your seawall is now damaging the neighboring property, damaging state-owned land, you probably lost your right to create a nuisance. I think due process claims and equal protection claims are probably going to not prevail either. The state's probably going to win those. And I think ultimately, even the regulatory takings claims, if ever there was a Lucas firm principle of state property law, it's our public trust doctrine. It's probably going to prevail on that. The big star on the side is all of the seawalls that have gone in and how we deal with those. I'm pretty much out of time. There are two questions I noodle on that I explained in the law review article is what if it weakens public trust doctrine to protect private property rights? Could they do that? You can look to conservative property rights case law in the state where the state was prohibited from changing common law doctrine and say they shouldn't be allowed to do it here. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. The other cases, what about this passive filling? When would it make sense to say, well, we're going to let people armor? And there's a takings case that kind of again goes to protect private property. You can take the same principles and say, this is state-owned property. We're not going to allow passive filling except under specific consequences. Where you have a city, it really doesn't make sense. You've got to pick up and move back. But we've got long stretches of beach where it's privately owned homes. Are we really going to allow all of that to get armored to protect single spread out homes, even though it's really expensive and wealthy people living there? Legally, maybe not. So this is the very front, and I hope we get some discussion about it's time to rethink. This is a crisis that's coming. We're not going to avoid this. We just start talking about it and thinking about it hard. Maybe ultimately prohibit hard armoring about some kind of transition. Figure out where we're going to allow it to happen, but in other places, how. It's a really long law review article. It lays out all of these cases, all of this case law. It's all state specific law, but if you've got stuff going on in your state, there may be parallels there that might be helpful to you to look at the way we've analyzed it and carry forward from there. Thank you.
Well, first, I'd just like to begin by saying a great thanks to Columbia University for hosting this biannual, and I'm delighted to be up here with some of these fellow presenters. It's a pleasure to learn what they're doing. My name is Thomas Rupert. I work with Florida Sea Grant, and momentarily I'll have a presentation. If you could just talk directly into them. Thank you very much. So, a little bit of a caveat before I begin here. What I'm going to talk about today is something I really have not heard others talking about yet. And I first wrote this and got it published a couple of years ago and have never actually talked about it publicly because it just didn't seem like there was ever an opportunity for an audience that actually wanted to hear about this kind of stuff. So I'm really excited to actually finally talk about this in an appropriate venue. it's really about what are we going to do about cleaning up the places that we are going to be losing. We keep seeing these pictures of places that are being lost, and you wonder what happens to these places. And I actually focus specifically on residential properties, and not because they are necessarily the worst. Clearly, EPA has done some evaluation of Superfund sites at risk of sea level rise. There are people thinking somewhat about some industrial issues and those sites and their cleanup. But residential is so ubiquitous, and it is just, there's so much of it. And well, we'll keep getting into it. But losing these homes makes a real mess out of our coastal areas. I remember years ago, we'd joke about, well, it's great, we lose this front line of properties, and then you've got a whole new set of beachfront properties. Isn't that beautiful? You don't actually lose tax revenue. It just migrates backwards to the highest value property. But realistically, if we aren't taking care of how we clean these places up, who's going to want that property? Because as we can see, I think the latest examples that we've seen come out of Raritan, North Carolina, where we've seen, again, homes falling in. They've lost a street or two now back worth of homes over the past few years. And that creates some real health and public safety issues on the beach. Florida, we've heard of hurricanes before. What do you use for missiles? Well, housing. And of course, the environmental damage. It's not just the building materials, but what's in those homes as well, what we store. Look in your garage, look under your sinks. There's plenty of garbage in there too. And what we've seen with, again, in Raritan, when this has happened recently, is they're looking for volunteers to try to clean up 5 to 7 miles of beach. Is this going to be our public policy about how we deal with abandoned properties, is we're going to look for volunteers? Oh, sorry, I was going to actually, how many of you have actually seen this video? Well, now I'm not going to get it to play. Let's see if we can. Anybody here actually seen this before? Yeah, so this is what we do when we can't figure out what we've really got a public policy on this. This is what we watch happen. And, that ended up just debris spread 5 to 7 miles down the beach. And of course, this is, again, like Dick was talking about there in Michigan, these are places that market themselves on their beaches. And that's a revenue and an economic lifeline for them. So one of the first questions that I always like to ask them when it comes to policy issues is really, and who was it? One of you mentioned this. We don't often ask these kind of fundamental questions. We focus on the technical. Why? Because that's so much easier than asking the fundamental questions that are a lot harder. And for me, one of the basic questions is, who pays? Because it has real distributive impacts in our lives about the decision on who pays. It also really follows our basic economic premise that typically we think we should internalize costs rather than externalize them. And coming from Florida, one of the things I consistently see is policy that privatizes the benefits of coastal development and socializes those costs through externalization. So if you're going to ask the question of who pays, very often we like to look then, well, who do we see as quote unquote responsible for the situation that we're confronting? And there is plenty of blame or responsibility, however you want to say it, to go around for our coastal vulnerability and the future loss of residential development. So who could pay? You've got some that might argue, well, the fossil fuel companies, we're suing them, right? Well, if you're going to hang your hat on that, I think you might be waiting a long time before local governments are actually able to use fossil fuel company money from those lawsuits to be able to pay for this. The developers, I think for new development, great. This is a real possibility if we can get our political act together and generate the political will to do this, because clearly they are making massive profits. And then again, leaving the public footing the bill for the disasters that follow. And the problem with developers is even if we do get the political will to really put them on the hook for the future losses of what they're developing now. What about all the development that we've already got that's at risk? So then you look at property owners. Well, they should have been smart enough not to buy this, right? Well, we all know from looking at the equity lens, that's way oversimplified as an argument, but there are still some reasons to look at property owners. So we'll get to that. Local governments, I don't think that they are going to be reliable, to be honest, because by the time you are losing significant numbers of residential homes, you are already going to be confronting a local government that has been spending inordinate amounts of money trying to build protective infrastructure at the same time that they're losing property tax value. So depending on general tax revenue at that local government level, I don't think that's going to be a viable solution either. State government, potentially, they might have deep enough pockets to engage in this for a while. The question then becomes, is that another externalization of the costs of development in our coastlines? And the same applies essentially to the federal government. And then Dick touched on this, and it's another one of these issues with this. Who has authority or responsibility to even do this? We have seen lawsuits around the country so far in our coastal areas where local governments that tried to clean up houses before they became a disaster that were already in the water were sued and lost. Why? Because the house was already in the water, below the mean high water line. It was only the state that had authority to do that, not the local government. But then you've got other local governments that were getting sued because they hadn't cleaned up derelict properties that were on the beach. So it's really a mess out there right now, and there is no consistency or clarity on this issue. But even if we can get some clarity on the authority and responsibility, again, I think it's going to come back a lot to the funding. As I mentioned, I think local government, you're not going to have a lot of luck there just because of the general dynamics of the finances, and the developers. We'll talk about that, and then we'll get to the owners again at the end. So one of the things I originally thought of, well, surety bonds. Sure, you could do this, right? Couldn't you say to a developer, okay, we'll let you build in this place. We know it's going to be subject to these coastal hazards and sea level rise eventually. But if you give us a surety bond, then we'll allow you to do it, right? But I think when I started digging into this a little more, a surety bond, it's really not insurance. You think it kind of sounds like it, but what you've actually got with this is you've got your principal, which is your property owner, in this case, the developer, and that developer pays the surety company for a policy that then will comply with any local government requirements. But if that developer is committing to saying, we will take this out and be responsible for cleaning it up if it's deemed at some point uninhabitable, then if the developer fails to do that, the surety company is going to pay. They're on the hook. The trick is, though, the surety company didn't charge the developer the cost of doing that. They only provided them a bond that says, we will do it. Now the surety company, by contract, has a legal right to go after the developer for their full costs of doing the actual cleanup. So you've only got a viable market here for bonds if the surety companies believe that those developers are long-term and stable enough and have the resources for the surety company to go after them for the payout if they don't do what they said they would as developers. So that's a real question here, and I think, look at the history of Florida and the long history of development and kind of hucksterism and shysterism that has occurred there, and whether or not the surety companies are going to buy that developers aren't just going to fold one company and open another. I don't know. I'm not too sanguine about the possibilities there. I think, unfortunately, it might really come down in many ways to it makes the most sense, possibly, to look at the actual properties proactively funding their own cleanup. Why? Because it does a couple of the things that we actually do tend to say we like in economics, even if we don't implement them as much as we say we like them. And that is, again, that internalization of the costs that are being created by a specific party. We could try to do this through tax liens. Anybody familiar with a tax lien here? So essentially, there's just this idea that you could say, okay, if the property becomes derelict because it's abandoned and it's still not below mean high water, which is now the state's responsibility, but it's still above mean high water, so you as local government have the authority and responsibility, you can engage in code enforcement on that property and say it's derelict, it's not up to code. When they don't fix that, then you as the local government now have the authority to come in, do it yourself, and put a tax lien on the property. Ordinarily, then, that would lead you to probably an eventual foreclosure action on the property, which allows you as the local government to mandate sale of the property. First, you're first in line to take out all the money from that sale that you put in. So who's going to buy this? This is the exact system that completely failed the city of Detroit as Detroit went through its contraction. And it was the state and federal governments that spent tens of millions of dollars trying to remediate and buy and demolish all these abandoned properties. And again, so I think just it's not a viable model what we're currently using. And there's another tool called municipal services taxing units. That it'll go by different names in different states. I used Florida law as a model because that's where I work. This is subject to dramatic limitations in the state of Florida, probably much more dramatic than in most states across the country. Local governments are hemmed in constitutionally and statutorily by how much they can raise their tax property rates. So that's going to be extremely difficult for them to keep up, again, with that dynamic that you're going to see decreasing property values at the same time you've seen massive increases in infrastructure spending. Then you come to the idea of, well, could we use what's called special assessments in the law? And a special assessment but usually is, say, your local government, maybe they want to build new drainage infrastructure for your neighborhood. But it's really about your neighborhood that this drainage structure is specifically going to serve. They might float a bond, and the repayment for that bond is going to come off of special assessments for all the properties that benefit specifically from this drainage project. That is a real option that we're going to get into, but there are some real legal issues with it. And then possibly also combine that with this idea of reverse amortization, or amortization of just, paying off over time. And finally, then, there are the considerations, obviously, if we are going to charge properties, that's going to have massively differential impacts depending upon the property owner. For some property owners, it might be nothing more than a minor inconvenience that their annual tax assessment may include, another $1,000. For others, that might be something that really sends them over the edge. So there is a real justice and equity issue here. And for that, I really went for guidance on how to kind of think about that. I really went to some of the National Research Council work that they have done for the National Flood Insurance Program, because they outlined it pretty well, and that's some of the material I used in the book chapter. But I want to go back to this idea of special assessments. I concluded that they are currently the most likely candidate in state law for how this could be financed proactively based on the specific properties. There is this little complication, though. A special assessment has to provide a special benefit to the property. It's really a two-part test. It has to be, the charge to the property has to be proportional to the benefit to the property, but then it has to offer this special benefit. What is the special benefit of charging a property proactively to clean it up when it's abandoned? There are ways to characterize that. You might be able to characterize it as it's something that increases the value of the property while it's still usable because it's not being subjected to other abandoned properties. Clearly, again, go back to the example of Detroit. What did it do to the value of properties that weren't yet abandoned when they were surrounded by abandoned properties? You've got crack houses and places where people are squatting surrounding your house. It didn't help. So there are potential ways, but I think really the safest way would be specific legislative authorization for a program that would define that this is an applicable use of a special benefit assessment. Then the chapter dives into how would you start thinking about this? Thank you. How would you start thinking about developing a program like this? And that's where it gets to be a real mess, honestly, and just start trying to think about how do you create that administrative process at the local level if you can do this. First, consider which properties are you going to consider for funding this way, for this reverse amortization, and when. Most local governments, at least in Florida, already are either specifically at the local level or via state sea level rise estimates, already have estimates of how much sea level rise over what period of time. So you get into some real challenges here, though. One, this is obviously going to be an incredibly politically and emotionally fraught thing to try to get a community to go through. We in Florida can't even reestablish what we call our coastal construction control line, which is merely a jurisdictional line for a state permitting program. This would be infinitely more difficult. For this coastal construction control line, the technical analyses for a reassessment of it usually takes about a year. But then the actual administrative process of trying to implement the new line based on the administrative analysis usually takes 7 to 10 years just because of the legal wrangling. And again, that's merely a jurisdictional line. This isn't something that actually is taking property and charging it because the local government admits that it's anticipated to be abandoned. So I think the reason I haven't spoken more about this yet is I just don't think there are many communities that are ready to consider this. It is going to happen. The disadvantage of waiting until our back is against the wall, obviously, is you can no longer do this. Because if you're going to do this, there's a trade-off in this which properties and when. The more specific, the shorter time period you use, the more accurate you're going to be. But the shorter time period you use, the shorter your amortization period and the higher the yearly charge if you're going to make those properties pay. It's the same thing with the cost estimates for properties that are identified based on your sea level rise estimates. The longer you go out, the less accurate you're going to be on those cost estimates. But the longer you go out, you've got more time again to charge those property owners. And that is really the key on that, the key for determination of that amortization period. Finally, there are a lot of questions about administrative processes and structure. You need to have good accounting processes that effectively sequester this money, because if you don't, local governments are going to raid it. They're going to take it for something else. There's going to be cash sitting there. Then there are questions about interest on that money that's sitting there. How can that be gained and used? And clearly, again, the equity and social justice concerns. Unless this is a clearly authorized statutory program, I don't think you're going to be able to cross-subsidize. The whole idea of a special benefit area, again, it's specific to properties. You're not going to be able to say, look, these wealthy property owners, we're going to charge them a little extra so that these people we don't have to charge. Not going to work. And going directly back to the point that Ju-Ching made earlier, I love it. That idea of we need to stop thinking about these policy processes specifically from an individual private property rights perspective. We need to think about them much more community and process oriented. I think it's the only way we may be able to find more rational policy options. If you'd like more information, a lot more specifics on this, here is the book chapter. And if you scan that, you can download the PDF for free. Not the whole book, just that chapter. They didn't give me the rights to the whole book, just that chapter. And finally, you should end with a little humor if we can't acknowledge how bad it is. Thank you very much.
Right. Thanks, everyone. So we're going to open the floor for questions to our four panelists. If you want to go ahead, there are some working microphones over there. For those of you who are available on Zoom, please feel free to drop a question in the session Q&A. However, if you're here in person, I'll run this mic over to you. So feel free to raise your hand and I'll get my running shoes on. Maybe not run, just walk fast.
Yeah.
I had a question about the presentation that we just heard, maybe more of a comment. I was also just thinking of additional tools, like if you could use property transfer taxes. And maybe there's even a way to structure this like a bottle deposit where, you're paying something up front, and if you manage to sell the house without it falling into the water, then you would get it back with, perhaps a partial amount of interest. The other really straightforward one for new developers would just be to use exactions, right? And to risk spread across all the new coastal development. So those were just two thoughts I had for you, and I really enjoyed the presentation.
Yeah, thank you. I do mention exactions in there. Unfortunately, the law on exactions has been becoming much more exacting in the last few years, to be honest. And I think it presents a lot of challenges to effectively use. But I absolutely agree that it's a huge difference between new development and existing. And the only thing stopping us from doing a better job with new development is, quite honestly, a lack of political will to do so.
Well, if I could jump into the big political problem we saw in North Carolina and Michigan are the realtors. They object even to disclosure statements. I could see them screaming bloody murder if we started putting a tax on transfers to fund stuff like that. But that's going to be a huge political hurdle to overcome.
Hi, my name's Sydney. I'm with Washington Sea Grant, and I had a question for both Dick and Thomas. When I go to later read your respective papers that you've written, what advice do you have for someone coming from, for example, a Washington perspective or a different state's perspective? What can I do to best get the most out of what you've written, recognizing that state law, how we define the ordinary high water mark, and private versus public property lines are different in my state? Thank you.
So the public trust doctrine and the statutory laws are all state specific, but the issues all travel pretty well across all of the states. And the kinds of claims that you're going to see are going to be the same. So I would say just study up on the kinds of legal provisions that Washington has, and then compare that against the analysis that we've done and see if you can find parallel case law in Washington state that would line up with the way we've analyzed the issues in Michigan. And I bet you'll find lots of parallels.
Ditto. It really is. I noted at the beginning of the article that it is based specifically on Florida state law of special assessments. But as Dick noted, there are very, very clear similarities across states. And there are different levels. The property law is probably the most similar. Then the special assessment law is more different, and the tax law is more different. And then the special assessment law could probably vary even the most. But it's close enough where it's very analogous.
Yeah.
Thank you for such a great set of presentations. I guess a cross-cutting theme that I was contemplating across the presentations was the emphasis on new mechanisms versus existing mechanisms. And for the existing mechanisms, is it a question of just applying them more effectively, more stringently? And I guess when you think about kind of the options you're looking at, where do you sit in terms of we need to do things totally differently from the past versus we just need to do more ambitiously the things we have done somewhat well in the past? And across both of those, it feels like the question of how we experiment is quite different. So if it's new mechanisms or new places, are there ways to relax some of the massive constraints, whether it's soft planning as a status quo or in deliberate areas? And for things that are just radically new, how do we move towards those?
I'll say that we found no cases of radically new unless they were extremely small and experimental and well-funded. So basically Europe. Sorry. Oh, and by the way, the only, there were cases that required removing structures. So retreat, another line of analysis we're doing is what constitutes retreat and relocation. So that very few projects required removing structures, and they were only if they were ecologically focused. So those are the most innovative, the ones that have an ecological goal and actually very closely related to ongoing coastal science work, right? So that they're looking, what you were talking about, the natural retreat and accretion, right? So coastal scientists have thought about this quite a lot, but they don't have the law. So I would say creating things de novo. I mean, I'm sure people understand it, like who and what authority. I thought was very important. All of these are like the authority thing is extremely important. So.
Yeah, I'm going to riff on that. Think about peanut butter and chocolate. I've been collaborating with a coastal engineer now for 15 years who could see what was happening as our shorelines erode and we're building seawalls and they're failing and doing all this damage. He didn't know the law. We met at a seminar U of M put on, and he's like, I know the science, I want to stop it. And I'm like, I know the law, I don't know the science as well as you do. Peanut butter and chocolate. Look for collaborations where we can come together. And of all of the communities in Michigan, I know of one, a township that's prohibited the installation of hard armoring. Well, they did that after a series of webinars that our state Sea Grant Coastal Management Program put on, where Guy would present the science, I would present the law. And the local officials realized, oh my gosh, if we allow armoring, we'll lose our beach. Who's going to want to come to a beach community that doesn't have a beach? And the shoreline property owners realized, maybe there's a reason to say, I'm going to enjoy my property while I can, but I'm not going to destroy it because it's a losing proposition. That's a hard push, but political will. So it's not just integrating across the agencies, it's integrating across the disciplines and lining up the technical expertise with the legal expertise. The other case I'll mention quickly is the state was issuing permits like crazy for seawalls. I talked to state officials. Most of them had not been around the last time. There's loss of institutional knowledge. Wow. They didn't realize this is problematic. Wow. They were handing out permits like candy. We sent a letter to them that laid out all the science, and then they started denying permits. And they used all of that literature to say, this is a long-term problem. We're not going to let it happen here. So there's all this institutional momentum that's moving forward, and people maybe who don't realize what's going on, you've got to feed them information. You've got to line up the disciplines and kind of lay it all out. Like, if we keep going down this route, we're going to lose all of our beaches. Well, we didn't realize that. This something for us to think about. But man, it's taken a lot of work and a lot of time, and there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, I'll just add on that. I feel like it's not about creating new mechanisms, but it's like, for instance, the story I'm telling is that it's unavoidable institutional shift is happening, and how we better utilize these already existing tools at hands to leverage and then to make a difference. Yeah.
Oh, may I just add one other thing? One of the things, those coastal scientists are so interesting. So one of the things that they pointed out, years ago, was they said, wait a minute, the same agencies that were building these barrier protections for 100+ years, are they going to be in the lead? Because really, how much are they going to want to change what they've done, right? The prestige is built around building. It's not built around retreating, right?
And they're also usually engineers. Engineers, are there engineers in the room? The engineer's solution is, we can engineer our way out of this. There are just places you can't. You have to say, we're going to let nature do what nature's going to do, because it just doesn't make sense to fight nature. I've had engineers come up to me and say, I know that's true. I hate it. I hate it that you're telling me that, because I want an engineer solution to it. Well, we need to stop fighting nature maybe in every place we are.
And I guess maybe to add on to what Ms. Huang said, I think we do need some new, but I think there's also just more radical governance change. And I think that's only going to happen when the suffering is bad enough. I mean, I hate to be that pessimistic, but look at the entire system we've got now is a system that creates massive risk and vulnerability in so many areas. And it's in the economic, rational self-interest of all the actors involved to continue to do that, despite the fact that it's a massive loss to us as a society. And so until we change systemic drivers, I don't think we're going to get anywhere. And I think the only way you change systemic drivers is when the suffering is bad enough and you can point out to people that the suffering is being caused by your systems.
And that when litigation happens, the courts only work with the information that's put in front of them. And local officials only work with the information. The other big problem we have in Michigan is it's the engineers who are doing the private seawall designs who are coming into the local officials and saying, you can have your cake and eat it too. We'll build this and you'll have great beaches too. And then if they get pushed on it, well, okay, maybe not. But the local officials don't have the science on the other side to be able to question that. And the institutional structure is set up to favor the property owners who have the money to hire the engineers to design the seawalls, and you don't have the scientific evidence and action on the other side to say, no, wait, let's think this through. So there's a whole lot of, and designing more web-based tools to give to local officials isn't going to get us much further down the road. There's a whole nother realm of scientific technical assistance that we need to figure out to really give local officials the knowledge they need at the time they need it, in the form they need it to make a decision, and not just say, oh, go look at our tool. Because it's not, you still need to have technical knowledge to use the tool. So there's a huge disconnect there on the technical transfer that needs to deal with as well.
We have one final question as we are currently at time. So with that being said, I will turn it over and then we will say goodbye for now.
Thank you. Dick, this is a question follow-up on the legal analysis you did in Michigan. I'm curious if you had been able to uncover any sort of broad public sentiment that was in favor or against the different arguments you outlined in Michigan, and what role that plays, or you see it playing in the continued fight against armoring or not armoring.
Yeah, two things. When we've gone out and given lots of webinars and quite often to shoreline property owners who are hearing this stuff, and you can tell in the audience where they're landing. So I've seen these public debates where it's my property, by God, I have the right to do anything I need to do to protect it, even if it destroys the beach. And then other property owners will say, wait a minute, no, you don't. You don't have the right to do that. And I'll have people come up and talk to me afterwards. So don't think that all property owners see the world the same way. There's variation along that front. And then the other thing, having said that, just real world politics is probably true. It's the wealthy shoreline property owners who get the ears of the legislature. So our agencies, in their defense, are scared to death of denying permits because they're afraid that a mad property owner is going to go to the legislature and weaken the laws that they have to work with because it's happened in the past. Yep. And so we're caught in this dialogue, and it's only when you kind of lay out for everybody the long-term consequences, then people start to step back and say, oh, maybe we don't want to go there. But who's in power in the state house? Who are they listening to? All of the real world politics plays out that way too. New York has this huge problem with flooding on Lake Ontario. Property owners are screaming bloody murder. You need to regulate water levels more, but that's going to push water back into Montreal. There are no easy solutions here. And it's really hard to get legislators to understand the long-term consequences of their decisions. It's not a very hard. Are you all depressed? I mean, when you really study this, it gets kind of depressing.
Oh, no. We had plenty of cases with very creative solutions.
Here's the happy, yeah. There's so much we should be protecting, and we should be doing a much better job than we're doing, and there's no easy ways out. But the longer we hold off, the more we're backing ourselves into a wall, and it'll be much more difficult to deal with the problems when they hit. So we've got a lot of challenges in front of us. Was that a good way to end?
It was perfect. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to our panelists. For those of you on Zoom, our apologies for the tech issues. We hope you enjoyed it regardless, and a recording will be available as well. Please take care.